Chapter 7 Hegel and Feuerbach. We now make a great leap from ancient India to Marx and Engels, from the 6th century BC to the 19th century AD, a leap of over 25 centuries. I should like to have dwelt on some length on the classic worldview as represented in the bourgeois revolution of the 18th century by the French materialists, as well as on the more salient fact of classical bourgeois philosophy in Germany. Unfortunately, there is no space for this. I can only give a short resume of the immediate forerunners of Marx and Engels, the German philosophers Hegel and Feuerbach, in order to indicate the nature of the epoch-making advance which Marx and Engels achieved beyond the furthest outpost of the philosophy which preceded them. But first, I must insert some general preliminary comments, particularly on that great period that intervened between the ancient philosophy of Greece and India, and Hegel, Feuerbach, and Marx. Between modern bourgeois philosophy in Europe and ancient philosophy lay the age of feudalism. Its ideological expression is the feudal world view, which dominated the whole of the Middle Ages, a period about 1,000 years from about 500 to 1500 AD. This period was subject to the overpowering influence of the Church. The Church formed the apex of the ruling feudal classes of the Middle Ages. It was at the same time the strongest ideological support of the feudal mode of production and the feudal system of authority. During the period of the Church's uncontested supremacy, philosophy and natural science as well played no independent role. Philosophy was concerned only with the justification and elucidation of the basic doctrine of the Church. Philosophy was, as it was called at the time, the handmaiden of the Church. This philosophy, which occupied itself only with justifying and explaining the basic doctrine of the Church, was called scholastic philosophy. The term comes from a Latin word meaning school, hence this is the philosophy of the ecclesiastical colleges of the Middle Ages, of the schools in which the lofty spirits of the Church were educated. We need not tarry with this scholastic philosophy, which played no independent role and made no scientific progress worth mentioning. At the same time, we must note that the development of natural science during the feudal Middle Ages was also very weak and paltry. But even during the reign of feudalism, in the very lap of feudal society, the bourgeoisie developed. We can designate the end of the 15th century as the critical point when the bourgeoisie began to make itself felt more strongly. The outstanding events which determine this as the critical point are the discovery of America, the inventions of printing and gunpowder, the universal application of the compass to ships, and a number of other discoveries. A particular characteristic of this transition from the Middle Ages to modern times is the expansion of world trade, not only through the extension of trade to the newly discovered world, America, but also through maritime trade with Near, Middle, and Far East, which does not assume large proportions until this period. Concomitant with this development of the bourgeois mode of production, a general struggle begins against the highest rank in the feudal social order, against the Church. This conflict becomes sharper at the turn of the 16th century. You are aware that the Reformation occurred then. Luther, as well as Calvin and Zwingli, emerged. The Reformation is a revolt against the Church, though still within the boundaries of the Church and of religion. But the most universal and radical form of ideological struggle with feudal society in general and the Church in particular was bourgeois philosophy. It is very significant that bourgeois philosophy first emerged in the countries where bourgeois development was most advanced. Thus, first in England, in the Netherlands, then France in the 18th century, and finally in Germany. It emerged in Germany last because, in comparison with France and England, Germany went through a much longer bourgeois development. The men who are called the fathers of modern bourgeois philosophy are the Englishmen Bacon and the Frenchman Descartes, both of whom appeared in the first half of the 17th century. The development of bourgeois philosophy follows on the heels of the religious struggle. These religious struggles were the prerequisite, the foundation on which philosophical development was laid. In philosophy, we see the epitome of the bourgeois class struggles against the feudal worldview, as well as the most general form of the development of the bourgeois class consciousness. The main purpose and substance of bourgeois philosophy we can describe as follows. First, the overthrow of the basic concepts of the Christian religion in particular, and of religion in general. The extension of the authority of reason to include realms where religious belief had hitherto been master. Second, a likewise important purpose of the new philosophy was to make room for the expansion of natural science. The development of natural science is a prerequisite for the economic development of bourgeois society. Natural science, in its turn, became a sharp weapon against ecclesiastical belief, especially those natural sciences which were most highly developed in the 17th and 18th centuries. Mechanics and astronomy, especially celestial mechanics. Natural science had a strong influence on the development of philosophy. The union of natural science and philosophy in the struggle against the church and against the feudal worldview in general was most vigorously expressed in 18th century French materialism. I will mention only the names of two men in whom this view took on especially classic form. One of these is Diderot. His is the most ingenious mind of all the French materialists. The other is Helvetius, who incorporated the materialistic worldview of the 18th century into a complete system. You are probably already familiar with the names of Voltaire and Rousseau. They are the most significant bourgeois literary authors of the 18th century. They likewise led the struggle against the church and against feudal institutions. But in respect to philosophy, they were not as radical as Helvetius and Diderot. They were not materialists, but they advocated a religion of reason. They sought to eliminate the feudal features from Christianity. What they wanted was a bourgeois Christianity. The highest stage of bourgeois philosophy was reached in Germany. Germany, as I have already said, took longer to develop economically and politically than France and England. It thus came about that the bourgeois revolution occurred there under generally more advanced conditions, with a more highly developed ideology than in both the other countries. We select from this development only the two end products, the philosophies of Hegel and of Feuerbach, because two are directly connected with and immediately precede dialectical materialism. They are the forerunners of Marx and Engels. In this development, Hegel and Feuerbach play entirely different roles. Hegel is the positive consummator of bourgeois philosophy and of philosophy in general. Feuerbach is its negative consummator. Through him, religion as well as philosophy was destroyed by criticism. Hegel, during the period of his greatest achievement, was professor of philosophy at the University of Berlin. His first great work he completed in the year 1806, the same year that Napoleon edicted a severe defeat upon feudal Germany at the Battle of Jena, when he overthrew Prussia and split Germany into two parts, north and south. Hegel died in 1830, the year of the July Revolution in France, and just before the Reform Bill in England. In Hegel, all bourgeois philosophy is comprehended, and more than that, in him, ancient philosophy is joined with modern, so that he summarized the intellectual development of 2,500 years, and carried it to its conclusion. Hegel was one of the most profound and at the same time one of the most universal minds that ever lived. Hegel was a pioneer of the bourgeois revolution in Germany, which broke out in 1848, although he himself was not a political revolutionary. I will now briefly present the substance of Hegelian philosophy. The most important and revolutionary was the dialectical method. Hegel discovered dialectics anew, so to speak. He was the first to elaborate it systematically and put it on a much higher plane than it had previously been. This was a revolutionary act of the highest order. Dialectics was an extremely revolutionary method. Dialectics teaches that no individual thing, whether in the external world or in thought, remains static, but that it is constantly changes, that every single thing, every single institution, must have a beginning and therefore necessarily an end, a rising and a declining phase of development. Dialectics teaches that everything, every institution, every thought disappears because it is transformed into its opposite. Dialectics halts for nothing. Nothing is scared to it. Nothing is inviolable. This destructive power of dialectics is, in the Hegelian view, the strongest force of historical progress, or, as Goethe, who lived in the time of Hegel, said, quote, "All that exists has this much value, that it perishes." End quote. What this verse poetically expresses is conceptually developed in the dialectical method. Dialectics is the most universal formula of revolution. The second basic feature of the Hegelian philosophy is that it is idealistic. In fact, it is idealism of an extreme form. According to Hegel, the motion of thought, by which he means universal thought, universal concepts, ideas as he calls them, is autonomous, independent. Thought, the idea, is for him the mover and creator of material reality, of nature and of history. Intellectual motion, to put it concisely, is the creator of cosmic motion. Thought is the creator of reality. I will give you an example of Hegel's approach to history. According to our approach, Christianity in the Middle Ages is a doctrine which grew out of the feudal relations of production and social class relations. The relations of production of the Middle Ages are fundamental, primary, and from them are derived ideas of the Middle Ages, whose most universal expression is Christianity. According to Hegel's conception, the reverse is the case. In his view, medieval Christianity is fundamental. From that emerges the feudal mode of production, the class order of the feudal Middle Ages, its political forms, and so forth. Thus, according to Hegel, the world and its development are posited literally in the mind and in thought. In this way, Hegel demonstrates the pervasive interconnection of all parts of the social whole, of its spiritual and material structure. He further shows, and this marked an advance over all his predecessors, that social types form an historical progression, a developmental series which advances through contradictions. And he recognizes that the inner contradictions contained in every social form are the moving forces which supplant one historical period with another. Since he is an idealist, however, he does not expose these contradictions in the material forces, but looks for them in the most universal spiritual expression of the period in question. Hegel made the greatest and most profound discoveries in the realm of history, in which he revealed in his own way the interconnections of historical life. Although the form is here placed in the mind, the content signifies tremendous scientific progress. Another feature of Hegelian philosophy, and a deficiency in it, is that Hegel recognized a temporal development in history, but not in nature. According to the Hegelian conception, nature moves eternally in the same grooves. In this respect, Hegel reverts to the philosopher Kant, who sought to interpret the emergence of our planetary system by means of mechanistic theory. Finally, let us consider the relation of Hegel's philosophy to religion. With Hegel, there is yet no sharp contradiction between religion and philosophy. Hegelian philosophy undermines religion from within. All the basic concepts of religion contain for Hegel a purely philosophic meaning. They were put on the same plane with the basic concepts of logic or of dialectics, so that actually the fundamental concepts of religion retain nothing distinctive. but Hegel left their external form untouched. This was consistent with the level of the class struggle in Germany, where organization and propaganda for the bourgeois revolution were just being prepared. An open attack on the church and on absolutism was not yet propitious. It is pertinent that the founder of this philosophy, Hegel, was a professor at the most important university of the Prussian state, of precisely the absolutistic state against which the bourgeois revolution was directed. This was possible only because this philosophy was so extremely obscure and abstract that it was accessible to a restricted number of men schooled in philosophic thought. The Prussian guardians of absolutism not recognized that this obscure and abstract philosophy which Hegel propounded at the University of Berlin was something extremely revolutionary. Even today, it remains true that no one without a very thorough preparation in the history of philosophy and logic, as well as abstract thought in general, can make any headway in the study of Hegel's philosophy. Without this preparation, most of it will remain incomprehensible. The revolutionary character of Hegel's philosophy stands out in sharper relief in some of his students than it does in Hegel himself. These students directly attacked Christianity, which was then the state religion. Attack on Christian religion was thus a political attack on the existing state. The most important and the most radical of these students of Hegel was Ludwig Feuerbach. Though it was still possible for Hegel to be a regular professor at the university, his student Feuerbach had a different fate in store for him. For some time, Feuerbach tried to teach at the university in the role of Privatisten, or unsalaried lecturer. But he could not make any progress, and he finally had to retreat as a private teacher to a small village, where he wrote his principal works. In Feuerbach's hands, philosophy became so revolutionary that it could no longer be tolerated in the learned shares of absolutist Prussia. Feuerbach accomplished the open break with religion which Hegel had not achieved, and it is precisely in this respect that his book, The Essence of Christianity, was epoch-making. Moreover, with Feuerbach, a further break was made not only with religion, but also with philosophy as a special science, since in Feuerbach's view, philosophy was the last form of religion. Feuerbach achieved the transition from idealism to materialism. For Feuerbach, the substance of religion lies in one or another form of belief in a super-sensual, fantastic spiritual being as the creator and mover of the world. Philosophy teaches the same thing in a different form. Cosmic reason, which for Hegel is the world mover, is only another form of the Christian concept of God. The secret which is hidden behind this infinite spirit and will in which men represent as in another world beyond their perception is human understanding and will. Man is the real secret of religion and of philosophy. To put it very simply, the Christian and the Jewish religion as well maintain that God created man in his own image. Feuerbach maintains the reverse. God has not created man in his own image, but man has created God in his own image. This thought is similar to that of an ancient Greek. Quote, if ox had made a god, he would be an ox. If a black made a god, he would have a flat nose and thick lips. End quote. Man, that's fucking racist. That's what the hell? Ain't no way. They were wilding back then. Continuing. Feuerbach universalized this. He also applied it to philosophy. Philosophy, to him, is only a refined form of religion, of belief in God. According to Feuerbach, real knowledge is possible only as knowledge of the material, of the sentient. There is no supersensual knowledge, as religion and philosophy maintain. No knowledge which comes without sense perception or transcends the perceivable world. What is passed off as supersensual knowledge is nothing but a fantastic transformation of sense knowledge. Accordingly, there is no special philosophy, no special philosophic method by which one can construe the world out of one's own head. Knowledge of the world is possible only on the basis of sense experience. One cannot construct the world merely out of one's head as philosophy assumes. Any philosophic method which assumes that it can build the world out of mere thoughts must be rejected. Thought is not separable from matter. The epoch-making aspect of Feuerbach's theory consists first in the destruction of philosophy as a special form in the general field of science. Secondly, in the destruction of idealism, the transition to materialism. But the position which Feuerbach reached was in part only negative. What Feuerbach lacked in contrast with Hegel was dialectics. In the second place, Feuerbach lacked a materialistic comprehension of history. His position permitted him to think materialistically only about nature. He was unable to give a materialistic interpretation of history. Feuerbachian materialism was thus natural science materialism, and in the historical realm, this natural science materialism approached idealism. Thus, it was an incomplete and a defective materialism. This incompleteness provided one of the impulses which sent Marx and Engels beyond Feuerbach to dialectical materialism. Feuerbach, as the advocate of the radical bourgeoisie in Germany, made an advance over Hegel. In contemporary Chinese politics, he would be the equivalent of a left member of the Kuomintang. Chapter 8. From Natural Science Materialism to Dialectical Materialism. The last chapter took us as far as Feuerbach. I will briefly recapitulate the progress Feuerbach made over Hegel and the deficiencies which he evinced. The principal advances which Feuerbach made are 1. The transition from idealism to materialism. 2. The scientific rejection of religion. Feuerbach disclosed religion as the handiwork of men. Man creates God and the deities after his own image. Since Feuerbach, religion has been scientifically dead, scientifically vanquished. But I shall soon point out that it is not yet dead in practice. 3. Moreover, philosophy as a special science opposed to natural science, as a science which explains things purely through the mind, without experience, was also buried by Feuerbach. These are the principal advances which were made by Feuerbach over Hegel. Now, I shall consider the two fundamental deficiencies in Feuerbachian materialism. The first is that Feuerbachian materialism is only natural science materialism, that is, it is an incomplete materialism. Incomplete because Feuerbach was unable to give a materialistic explanation of the process of history. In Feuerbach, there is here a distinct lack. He does not know what to say. When confronted with the task of explaining history, other natural science materialists resort to the old idealism. This is either the usual idea that historical progress is conditioned by the progress of thought, ideas, or even more naively, that great men make history through the thoughts which more or less by accident crop up in their minds. This is the first deficiency. The second, with Feuerbach, is that he lacks the dialectical method. Yet this dialectical method was the great revolutionary advance which Hegel had made over all his predecessors. This advance was lost on Feuerbach. He recognizes dialectics neither in natural science nor in history. The decisive advance over the natural science materialism of Feuerbach was made by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. They were also the founders of scientific socialism. This decisive advance occurred in the middle of the 40s, some few years before the outbreak of the German Revolution. Feuerbach himself had written his book, The Essence of Christianity, in 1839, and his thoughts on the philosophy of the future in 1843. Marx and Engels took only a few more years to reach the point which Feuerbach had attained. Feuerbach was still a bourgeois revolutionary and belonged to the most radical, most progressive section in the bourgeois revolution. Marx and Engels also began as radical bourgeois revolutionaries, but they later went over to the side of the working class and became the founders of scientific socialism. They became socialist or proletarian revolutionaries, and only then was it possible for them to advance beyond the radical bourgeois position. Marx and Engels studied Hegel, the philosopher who dominated the entire period throughout the 20s and 30s, and Feuerbach. Historical or dialectical materialism was developed by them not only from German philosophy, other phenomena of the time also contributed. The most important are the following two. 1. The contemporary class struggles in England. This was the time of the Chartist movement in England, the first great modern working class movement. In England, then economically the most highly developed country, anyone could see that the true explanation of political struggles resided in the class struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. It was also unmistakably clear that this struggle between working class and bourgeoisie was based on the economic position of the two classes, on the fact that the bourgeoisie was in possession of all the means of production and piled up riches upon riches, while the working class, lacking means of production, was dependent solely on the sale of its own labor power. Thus, here was the most obvious place to study the materialistic explanation of historical events. As you know, Friedrich Engels spent several years in England as a young man. He here developed his interest in the workers' movement and received his first impulse towards historical materialism. The second impulse came from the history of the French Revolution. This had the greatest influence on Marx, who at this time was living in Paris and devoting himself to an exhaustive study of the history of the French Revolution. The bourgeois historians of the French Revolution had already seen that the events of the French Revolution could be explained in terms of the struggles of the different classes. Class struggles, as the propelling force of political history, became especially clear to Marx through the study of the French Revolution, while Engels came to understand the economic basis of the class struggles between the proletariat and bourgeoisie. Since these two men, Marx and Engels, came together since they applied the dialectical method which they had learned from Hegel, and since with Feuerbach they passed from idealism to materialism, the elements were brought together for the creation of dialectical materialism, and at the same time the scientific elements for the generation of socialism. What was the nature of this decisive advance which Marx and Engels made over Feuerbach? First, Feuerbach found the key to the materialistic explanation of nature. Marx and Engels found, in addition, the key to the materialistic explanation of history. Marx and Engels found this explanation in the manner and mode in which men acquired their living, how they produced their material livelihood. For this, they used the expression, quote-unquote, mode of production. The mode of production means nothing more than the manner and mode by which man earns a living. As Marx and Engels bluntly said, man must eat and drink before he can philosophize. All other things follow and are conditioned by the way he procures food and drink. This simple knowledge is the foundation of the materialistic explanation of history. With this, idealism was overthrown. The idealistic worldview was driven from its last refugee and completely vanquished. Feuerbach had driven God and the spirits from nature. Marx and Engels drove God and the spirits from history too. Of course, the God of the historical idealists was not crudely conceived as a personal God determining all historical events, but he was something more refined. Thoughts or ideas, lesser gods, so to speak, dominated history, and were supposed to determine historical events. Just as God, according to the religious writings of the Jews, is said to have created the world out of his mind, out of nothing, so, according to the conception above, the world spirit is supposed to bring forth history. With this conception, Marx and Engels made a radical and fundamental break. They recognized neither great nor small, neither crude nor refined gods in history, but they understood that in history, just as in nature, the material foundation determines the ideal, determines thought. Thus, for the first time, the conception of supersensual and higher beings, or forces, was completely destroyed. The last refuge of higher supersensual forces and powers was demolished. Through this advance, the supersensual creative role of the spirit, which even Hegel had acknowledged, was definitely played out, and at the same time, religion and philosophy as a special kind of interpretation of life were completely discredited. The second decisive advance of Marx and Engels over Feuerbach consisted in the fact that Marx and Engels again took up the dialectical method, which Feuerbach had dropped. But they did not take up this method in the form in which Hegel had left it. In Hegel, we have an idealistic dialectics. We have already seen what this was. In Marx, we have a materialistic dialectics. That is, Marx conceived of dialectics as the sum of the universal laws of motion of the real material world and the laws of thought in the minds of men corresponding to these universal laws. In other words, the real material world is dialectical. It follows the laws of dialectics, and dialectics also operates in the human mind, since the human mind is also a part of the material world. Thus, Marx and Engels retained the positive contribution of the history of philosophy. The history of philosophy, which, as you have seen, embraces more than 2,000 years, is not simply a mass of errors in the light of dialectical materialism. As long as philosophy sought a special kind of world explanation opposed to the natural science, materialistic explanation of the world, its attempt was fruitless, and it only piled error upon error. Philosophy, however, did make one real substantial contribution: the knowledge of man's capacity for thought. In the 2,000 or 3,000 years in which man has pursued philosophy, real progress has been made. The outcome is dialectics, theory of knowledge and logic. Dialectics was lost upon Feuerbach. With Marx and Engels, it is preserved and further developed into materialistic dialectics. Concerning this materialist dialectics, we shall speak in greater detail in the next chapter. Thus, one can say that Marx and Engels discovered dialectics, and at the same time, they did not discover it. I will now turn to the chief problems of the theory of knowledge from the point of view of dialectical materialism. The first problem to be solved is the fundamental problem presented by the idealistic and the materialistic worldviews. This is the problem of the relation of thought to the external world, which we can perceive through the senses, and thus the problem whether the external world is this table, this tree, this lamp, whether all this exists independent of my existence, whether all this has an objective existence independent of my existence, or is present only in my consciousness. This is the so-called problem of the objectivity of the external world. This is one of the basic problems of the theory of knowledge. Common sense has an immediate answer at hand. Of course, the lamppost exists independent of my consciousness, and I note this when I hit it with my nose. Likewise, I am impressed with the fact that a tree exists independent of my consciousness if it falls upon my head. But common sense is not the ultimate arbiter in questions of science. Against this doctrine of common sense, the idealistic philosophers have posed very weighty, significant objections. They say that in the last analysis, the tree does not physically enter my head. This can happen, but it puts an end to thinking, but rather the tree enters my head only as an idea. It enters only into my consciousness, and if I inquire into everything that happens to me, I find, according to the idealistic conception, that all that I know are conscious states, ideas, which I have in my head. And hence, idealism comes to the conclusion that there is no world independent of human consciousness, but that everything exists only in my consciousness. I cannot know what is not contained in my ideas. Accordingly, idealism says consciousness is all, and if I think that anything else exists outside of me, then I am making an error of common sense. This applies not only to the tree, the lamppost, etc., but it also applies to other men, and in the last analysis, this line of reasoning leads me to the conclusion that only I exist, only my consciousness exists, and that all other men exist only in my idea. This is the final logical conclusion of this idealistic worldview. A few more interesting consequences follow from the contention that the world exists only in my idea. If this is the case, the earth can have had no existence before the arrival of man. This consequence is unavoidable. A second consequence, whenever a man is asleep, I am assuming that he sleeps without dreaming, the world always comes to an end, since if no consciousness exists, no world can exist. These are important consequences, but the question is, how can one refute the conception of, or the idea that everything that exists only in the ideas of men? If we cannot answer this, then we must accept the doctrine of idealism. But we must try. One might perhaps answer, I know that the tree exists independent of me. When I run into it, to this idealism can reply, if I run into a tree, I know this also only through my consciousness. The pain which I feel is an idea, a part of consciousness. Or let us take another case. I am struck by a bullet. According to the common notion, this exists quite independent of me. But when I become aware of this bullet, I become aware of it too, only through my idea. Hence, this argument is not worth very much. One must go deeper. We come to closer grips with the problem if we formulate the matter thus. According to the idealistic conception, everything that I know, that I feel, that I can sense, is present in consciousness, in thought, in the head. Now, I pose the question differently. Is what exists in my head, in my consciousness, everything? The conclusion of continuous investigation of human consciousness is that this consciousness itself contains in it its very essence, the knowledge that my consciousness is not everything, but only a part of the world. This consciousness is the first condition, and the point of departure of every thought. In self-consciousness itself we find the solution. It consists in the knowledge that my consciousness is not everything, but that a world confronts me which is different from my consciousness. Or otherwise expressed, thought is a part of being and stems from being, but not the reverse. Thus, in the last analysis, the problem is solved and aligned with common sense, but not with the same means of common sense. It is solved on the basis of the results of thousands of years of research into human thought, research which constitutes the real substance of philosophy. I should like to discuss further the example of the tree which we have already used. The tree is, as I have already said, in my consciousness. Only in this way do I know of it. But at the same time I distinguish it from myself in my consciousness. I know that I am something different from a tree. Only through this distinction is thought possible. Then there is another little problem to which I wish to refer. There are not only ideas which correspond to actual things, but there are also purely subjective ideas. At night, I look, for example, at the heavens and discover in some spot the glimmer of a star. This star can actually exist, or the impression can simply be the result of some disturbance in my eye. How can I distinguish whether it is really a star or merely some disturbance in the eve that arouses the impression of a star? I will give another example in order to make this question clear. As you know, there are mentally deranged persons who have certain erroneous sense impressions. Such a person believes, for example, that he hears certain noises which, of course, are not present. He simply imagines them. How am I to distinguish a real noise from such an imagined noise? I might tell you of something which once happened to me. I was going to bed. Suddenly, it seemed to me that the wall shook, and the pictures on the wall began to rattle. For this, different explanations are possible. First, the person who experiences this is not sober, and second, an earthquake may have occurred. How shall I distinguish? Here is the final determinant. I convince myself that my sense perception is either a subjective illusion, or that it is true by checking whether all men observed it. If, for example, I am an astronomer, and I see a star in the heavens, then I relay this observation to all the other astronomical observatories to see if they observe it. If no one else sees it besides me, then it is a delusion. This is the determining factor by means of which distinguished subjective form objective facts. Subjective experiences are limited to those who have them. Objective experiences are held by all. In the above-mentioned case of the earthquake, there is a simple means of determining whether one is quaking oneself or whether the earth is quaking. If one looks out of the window, if other men are also looking out of the window to determine whether the earth is quaking, one can accept the fact that there is an earthquake. But if one is alone in making this test, the assumption must be that the unsteadiness comes from one's own feet. We now turn to the second question. Is this external world, whose subjectivity and independence from thought we have now proved, is this external world of a material, corporeal nature? This is the contention of materialism. Or is the external world of a spiritual nature? This is the contention of idealism. Hegel, for example, says that things exist outside of human consciousness, but also that things are not of a material, corporeal nature, but spiritual. This is objective idealism. Materialism maintains that the external world is of a corporeal nature. This has been adequately proved by natural science. One more question and I will close. We have already said that natural science has established that the external world is of a material nature and consists of matter in its various forms and motions. Now the question is, what is thought itself? Is it something material or is it something else? The answer is, we observe that thought itself is bound to a material substance, to the human brain. It is a function of it, just as there is a function of the muscles, or just as it is a function of the glands to secrete fluids. Moreover, thought functions only in connection with material stuff, with sense perceptions. In this double sense, thought is material too. Sensation in general, simplest kind of consciousness, is bound up with the existence of the organism. The most highly developed stage, understanding and reason, is bound up with man and a special organ, the brain. Chapter 9. The Materialistic Theory of Knowledge. In the last chapter, we discussed whether the world has a material or spiritual nature. We came to the conclusion that all phenomena in the world are phenomena of a moving matter or material movement. We further said that even thought is a material quality, a quality which is bound up with a special organ, the brain. It can be said of this matter that it is as infinitely manifold as it is absolutely unitary. Chemists and physicists are approaching ever nearer to the unity of matter through the separation of matter into atoms and of atoms into smaller homogeneous particles. On the other hand, we see how this unitary matter is infinitely varied to form various substances, and nature is not the only source of an unlimited number of different substances. There is also man, who has added still more substances to those of nature. This happens, as you know, in the chemistry laboratory, where matter is created which is not present in nature. What is true of matter is also true of motion, which is inseparably linked with matter. Motion, too, is absolutely unitary, as well as absolutely manifold, infinitely multiform. From the simplest locomotion up to thought runs an infinitely manifold chain of material forms of activity. We came now to the next fundamental problem, to the problem of the relation of thought to reality. These are the questions. Are things knowable as they are in themselves? Is the essence of things knowable or are only phenomena knowable? Otherwise expressed, is truth knowable? Further, is truth knowable as a whole or only in part? Can thought know things without limit, or are there bounds, limits of knowledge which are resident in the nature of thought itself? And the next question, which is connected with the above, has truth certain distinguishing marks, and what are they? I will first give the objections which the idealistic worldview makes against our being able to know things as they are in our reality, in our being able to know the essence of things. The idealistic worldview says, it It is not possible to know the essence of things in themselves because all knowledge comes about only through the medium of thought. Through thought, however, things are not absorbed as they are in themselves, but they become changed. Thought is a tool, and like every tool, thought alters the matter to which it is applied, just as the potter changes the clay which he works by giving it a certain form. So thought recasts the thing which it wants to know. To this one might reply, we will know things as they are in themselves if we remove the form which thought gives to them. But if we remove this form, then they remain outside of thought. Hence the dilemma. The contradiction appears thus. Either things remain outside of thought, in which case they are not accessible to knowledge, or they are enter into thought, in which case they become transformed by thought, so that we can in no instance know how they exist in reality. This is the position of the idealistic worldview. To this we answer, what you idealistic demand is something meaningless, something which contradicts the nature of things. Since thought is associated with things, what occurs is no different from what occurs in any association of two things. When two things become associated, they mutually affect each other. Thing A acts on thing B, and B on A. The sun attracts the earth, and the earth attracts the sun. The sun influences the earth, and the earth influences the sun. No action without reaction. Through action and reaction, the nature of both things becomes manifest. To reject the effect of a thing upon other things is to reject the thing itself. Things act on thought, and thought acts on things. The relationship of thought is no different from the interaction between two things in general. It is absurd to ask that knowledge arise without thought working upon things. That is, to ask that a reaction occur without the occurrence of an action. With the rejection of the reaction, the action is rejected, and with both together, the thing itself or the essence of the thing is rejected. This is a contradiction, and not dialectical, but metaphysical. It is just as if it were expected that the stomach digest food without eating it, and without acting on it. Idealism further says, man cannot know the essence of things as they are in themselves, because his sense organs are a very special kind and apprehend things in a very special way. We know that certain color vibrations are apprehended by human eyes as blue, but to a bee or an ant, this color may appear not as blue, but somewhat like gray, or perhaps some other color. Human sense organs perceive things in their own peculiar way, a way which is different from the perception of these things by other organisms. Or let us take another example, an example from the sense of smell. We know that there are certain plants which have certain smells which attract particular kinds of insects. There are plants which have a smell like decayed meat, like carrion. This smell repels men, but certain animals are drawn to these plants by such smells. It can therefore be assumed that this smell affects these animals differently from man. These examples can be piled up. We could go on, for instance, to the feeling capacity. It can certainly be assumed that a certain temperature, which to men feels cold, is otherwise felt by a cold-blooded animal, by a fish, for example. Similarly, in the realm of tones, certainly the tone sensation of the insect or the fish is different from that of man. I cite all these things in order to point out that human sense organs, eyes, ears, etc., have a peculiar character and are different from those of other organisms in their mode of apprehending things. From this follows the objection of idealists that human knowledge is not an apprehension of things as they are, but a peculiar transformation which conforms not only to the nature of human thought, but also to human sense organs. The second point is that not only are the sense organs of man of a peculiar type, different from those of other organisms, but also that these sense organs are limited in their perception. If one might raise the question, are there not things, phenomena, which are not at all accessible to human senses? For example, we know that there are colors which cannot be perceived by human eyes, but whose presence can be established by other means. These are the colors at the extremes of the so-called color spectrum, ultraviolet and infrared. This applies not only to the perception of colors and differences in colors, but also to the perception of differences in brightness. Night animals, like the owl or the cat, observe differences in the degree of brightness at night which cannot be observed by human eyes. Similarly, for the other realms of sense perception, the range of perception of every sense organ has upper and lower limits, quantitative and qualitative, just as within its range it has quantitative and qualitative limits of discrimination. To this we answer that man has a peculiar means of overcoming the limitation of peculiarity of his sense instruments. This means is thought. It may be that the dog has a sharper nose, the eagle a sharper eye than man, and that other animals can perceive other things better than man. Nevertheless, the intellectual capacity of man extends far beyond that of any other organism, because he is able to elevate himself, through thought, above the peculiarity and limitations of his senses, not only through thought, but also through his hand directed by thought, through the construction of artificial organs, through tools. I need not enumerate the telescope, the microscope, the instruments and apparatus by means of which man artificially extends his sense organs, makes them keener and more exact. The main point here is that human thought overcomes the peculiarities of human sense organs. For example, colors, as the physicist conceives them, are reduced to vibrations of a certain material medium, to something which no longer has direct relation to human vision, or in the case of tones and noises, the physicist reduces them to air vibrations. This too is no longer bound up with direct perception through the car. Thus science thought knows how to overcome the peculiarities of human sense perceptions. But one may ask the question, what about the limitation of human senses? Is it not possible that there are certain qualities of things which are not perceivable through human senses? I have already said that there are certain colors which man cannot see with the naked eye, ultraviolet and infrared. But how does one know of these colors? How does one perceive them? Through special physical instruments. In the last analysis, all properties of things are accessible to man, if not directly, then indirectly, if not with the naked eye, then through artificial organs. This is the case because there are no properties in things which do not have some effect or other, and because the effects form a connected chain which can follow from one link to another. Still, another example, above a certain temperature, I cannot perceive heat with my bare hand, with my skin, but as a physicist, or a technician, I measure this heat with a specially constructed thermometer. And how do I perceive this thermometer? I read off the degrees by eye, so that in the last analysis, I do not perceive the heat with my skin, but with my eye. It must be added that this unlimited perceptibility of things is realized only through an unlimited process, the continuous extension of previous limits. Seen as a whole, this extension of limits is a continuous process. Viewed closely, it is a series of large and small steps. The further question which we raise is the question of the characteristics of knowledge, the question as to the criterion by which I determine that a proposition which I set up is true. The usual answer is this: I accept it as true when it is not contradictory. Contradiction is the criterion of error. What could be clearer, simpler, and more certain? This self-styled criterion of truth collapses as soon as it is seriously tested. I shall give a few examples. You know that we ascribe 3 dimensions to space: breadth, length, and height. But the physicist adds time to the 3 spaces dimensions to form 4 cosmic dimensions. Moreover, if I imagine that the world has 10 dimensions, no inner contradiction is involved. Nevertheless, I would not accept such a proposition as a statement of the physical structure of the world. As you know, there are legends about the sea serpent. It is said to be a serpent-like animal that swims in the sea and is 100 to 1,000 yards long. In the conception of the sea serpent, there is no contradiction. There is certainly no contradiction in the concept of serpent if I suppose its length to be merely 10 to 100 yards. Or let us take a figure from folklore or religion, say the idea of dragons or ghosts. All these ideas are not in themselves contradictions. I can logically conceive of them. The criterion of their falsehood lies not in inner contradictions, but in something else. There is also the reverse situation. I have already pointed out that even in a science like mathematics, contradictions occur without necessarily being the kind of inner contradiction which is the criterion of true and false. That is, there can be contradictions without falsity. I find the actual characteristics of truth not when I compare concepts with each other, but when I compare the concept with reality. This can only be done by observation. It may well be that the idea of ghosts contains no contradiction in itself, but it contains a contradiction when compared to the common experience that mental functions are bound up with bodies. Or take the dragon. I can well conceive of such an animal, but there is none exists in reality. This is just another example of fantasy. The laws according to which the planets move were first set forth by the astronomer Kepler. I test their correctness and the degree of their exactitude by observing the course of the planets. One of the best ways of determining whether I actually know things is experiment research. If I wish to know whether I have truly discerned that water consists of two elements, of oxygen and hydrogen, which are combined in certain proportions of weight, how do I determine that my contention is correct? Through experiment of two kinds. First, by bringing oxygen and hydrogen together under certain conditions of temperature and of pressure, and thus producing water. Second, by reducing water through chemical means into hydrogen and oxygen. Through this experiment, I discovered that this idea is no delusion, but corresponds to the actual nature of the thing. Such experiments are made on a small scale in the chemical laboratory. They are made on a large scale in industry. Industrial practice is likewise a test of the truth of my perception. Such experiments are not only appropriate in nature, but also in society. Politics, in the last analysis, is nothing but a series of experiments in the realm of society. If, for example, I set up the law that the small farmers must be won for the revolution in order to partition the land of the great landed proprietors among them, this can be false or true. I learn whether it is true by putting the matter to a test. We can now conclude. Practice, the activity of man, is the test of the possibility and extent of his knowing things. If from oxygen and hydrogen I can compose water, then to this extent I have correct knowledge of the nature of water. The further question arises, is complete or absolute knowledge of things possible? The answer is, I cannot know any single thing fully and conclusively at all at once. The process of knowing a single thing as well as knowing the whole world is endless. That is, complete knowledge of things is realized only through a series of relative and incomplete bits of knowledge. But this series represents absolute or complete knowledge. Accordingly, you arrive at a measure for the relation of the concepts, true and false. In everyday life, these opposites are placed absolutely and sharply against each other. A statement is either false or true. There is no third alternative. Knowledge, which comes progressively closer to things, always contains a bit of truth, but also a bit of untruth, of falsity. I will give a well-known example, the law of gravity. The universal law which governs the motion of the planets around the sun was first recognized by the great English natural scientist Newton in the 17th century. Until the 20th century, this was considered satisfactory and correct, until Einstein presented a more exact formulation of this law. But it would be childish simply to say that Newton's law is now false, that Einstein's law is true. Einstein's law contains an extraordinarily great approximation to the truth and, at the same time, an element of inexactitude. The Einstein law contains a greater element of truth and a lesser element of untruth and inexactitude. The truth and the false are contained in both, but the last, the Einsteinian, is a greater approximation to the absolute truth than the Newtonian law. Closely connected with this is the question whether I can fully know the world as a whole. as distinguished from the question whether I can fully know a single part of the world. Can I fully know the world as a whole? To this we say, yes, it is possible, but one cannot swallow the world as a whole all at once. It is too big. One knows the whole of the world through its individual parts. One must penetrate into the special sciences in order to know the world. With the progress of science, the picture becomes ever more manifold. Inversely, I can say that the universal idea of the world as a whole is the premise of every individual science. Without the premise that all things from a unitary world, I have no starting point for the individual science. The relation is such that the individual sciences, like physics and botany, presuppose the science of the world as a whole, and inversely, the science of the world as a whole is realized only through the individual sciences. The universal world concept is a matter of dialectics, and accordingly, we can say the individual sciences presupposes dialectics, and dialectics presupposes the individual sciences. Each conditions the other. Finally, the last question, which I will briefly answer, is a question which agitated thinkers for many centuries. Are there innate ideas in the human mind? Has man certain concepts in his head with which he comes into the world and which he does not first have to learn through experience? The answer is there are no innate particular concepts of the cat, the dog, or the donkey, or the tree, or the camel. Man learns everything through experience. There also are no innate general concepts, but there is an innate fundamental quality of thought, a natural fundamental characteristic of thought, just as salt, water, and ice have their characteristics. Of this fundamental quality or fundamental function of thought, we will speak in greater detail in the next chapter. But I wish to add this. This basic function of thought operates only in relation to the sensory experience. Moreover, thought behaves just like the other organs, for example, the stomach. The stomach digests only when it is given something to digest. The basic function of thought manifests itself only when matter is at hand for it. Chapter 10. Dialectics 1. In this chapter we will discuss dialectics proper. Previous chapters have shown that dialectics has a history which embraces many thousands of years, and that it has passed through various stages of development. Disregarding the beginnings of dialectics in Indian and Chinese philosophy, the following main stages can be distinguished. First, the dialectics of the old Greek philosophers of nature, Heraclitus. Second, the second and higher stage, the dialectics of Plato and Aristotle. Third, Hegelian dialectics, and fourth, materialistic dialectics. Dialectics itself has undergone a dialectical development. Heraclitus, representing the first stage, develops the dialectics of one after the other. Plato and Aristotle, representing the second stage, develop the dialectics of one beside the other. The latter is in opposition to the dialectics of the first stage, being its negation. Hegel embraces both preceding stages of development and raises them to a higher stage. He develops the dialectics of the one after the other and the one beside the other, but in an idealistic form. In other words, he develops an historico-idealistic dialectics. The dialectics of antiquity was limited. I pointed out earlier where the basis of this limitation is to be found, namely in the mode of production and the class relations of ancient Greece, particularly in the slave economy and in the social relations resulting from this slave economy. Not until the advent of materialistic dialectics were these limitations completely overcome. This new dialectics is not restricted, it is universalized. And here too I will briefly point out the relation of this universalized dialectics to the fundamental relations of class and production. Materialistic dialectics is developed by workers who have the working class point of view, the point of view of the proletarian revolution. This point of view demands the elimination of classes and consequently the elimination of class society. As a result of the elimination of classes and class society, the last limitation on social development and on the idea of development in general collapses. For Aristotle, as well as for Plato and even Hegel, class society itself was something that development could not transcend. For Plato and Aristotle, slave economy was the final and absolute limitation. With Hegel, it was bourgeois society. In dialectical materialism, however, or from the viewpoint of the working class society is not in itself ultimate or final. It is by no means the absolute limit of social development. It is itself subject to dialectical development and is part of the stream of social evolution. The generalized and at the same time materialistic form of dialectics is a natural result of the generalization of this point of view. Incidentally, bourgeois scholars have of late again turned to dialectics. In one form or another, Hegel's dialectics has been revived in Germany. In France, the philosopher Bergson has developed a peculiar form of dialectics. However, this bourgeois form of dialectics, as it has reappeared in recent years, is idealistic throughout, or as in the case of Bergson, it is an idealistic dialectics which at the same time reverts to the first stage of dialectics, i.e. to the point of view of Heraclitus. Dialectics may be characterized as the science which treats of the general relations in nature, in history, and in thought. The opposite of dialectics is the isolated consideration of things, and the consideration of things only in their fixity. Dialectics, on the contrary, considers all things in their most general relations, in their mutual relations of dependency, not in their fixity, but in their development. The question might be raised, how do we know of this mysterious science of dialectics? Whence do we procure this wisdom? There are three sources from which dialectics has been derived. The first source is nature, the observation of natural processes. This is how Heraclitus first came upon the idea of dialectics. The second source is the observation of human history, those changes which occur from one historical period to another, changes in the mode of production, in the forms of society, and in the social ideologies associated with them. This is the second source. The third source is the examination of human thought itself, and here a further question is raised. What is the guarantee that the laws of dialectical thought that we find in our minds correspond to the laws of reality, to the laws of change in nature and in history? This correspondence is not particularly remarkable, for man, after all, is only a part of nature. Human thought is, in the last analysis, a natural process, of the same kind as any other process in nature. That human thought corresponds to the laws of nature and history is therefore not astonishing. Rather, one could say that the opposite would be inconceivable. I cannot, of course, develop all the details of dialectics in a work of this scope. What I propose to do is to develop its fundamental laws. I shall give several examples as a basis of elucidation. Further, I shall point out the inner relation of these fundamental laws of dialectics. If these things are a bit difficult, it must be realized that they can only be understood through repeated study. Yet you will find that they are not incomprehensible secrets. That ultimately anyone can grasp them because everyone has the proof of dialectics in his daily experience as well as in his own mind. In this respect, human thought is exactly the same in all minds. The most general and the most inclusive fundamental law of dialectics, from which all others are deduced, is the law of the permeation of opposites. This law has a twofold meaning. First, that all things, all processes, all concepts merge in the last analysis into an absolute unity, or, in other words, that there are no opposites, no differences which cannot ultimately be comprehended into a unity. Second, and just as unconditionally valid, that all things are at the same time absolutely different and absolutely or unqualifiedly opposed. This law may also be referred to as the law of the polar unity of opposites. This law applies to every single thing, to every single phenomenon, and to the world as a whole. Viewing thought in its method alone, it can also be put this way. The human mind is capable of infinite condensation of things into unities, even the sharpest contradictions and opposites, and, on the other hand, it is capable of infinite differentiation and analysis of things into opposites. The human mind can establish this unlimited unity and unlimited differentiation, because this unlimited unity and differentiation is present in reality. A few examples will make this universal law clear. Take the example of night and day. There is the 12-hour day and the 12-hour night, a period of light and a period of darkness. Day and night are opposites. They are mutually exclusive. This, however, does not prevent their being, at the same time, parts of a 24-hour day. Take another example, male and female. These particular opposites played a decisive role in ancient Chinese philosophy. The opposition between male and female was made the fundamental law of the philosophy of Ye King, or Book of Transformations. Male and female are opposites, but this does not prevent man and woman from being identical, from coinciding as forms of the more general concept, mankind. Insofar as they both are forms of mankind, they are completely identical. Take other opposites in nature such as rest and motion. Common sense regards rest and motion as absolutely different processes. Whatever rests, and whatever moves, moves. The physicist, however, conceives of rest merely as a special kind of motion and vice versa. He can look upon every motion as a kind of rest. Those who are acquainted with modern physics will have a better comprehension of these things. Let us consider another opposition which appears to be absolute. It is customary to oppose art and nature. As opposed to the creations of nature, art is a creation of man. Art, however, is also a part of nature, since the man who produces art is in himself nothing but a part of nature. These examples could be multiplied indefinitely, and their implications are much more far-reaching than these simple examples indicate. I cite these, however, so that you will have a clear conception as possible of this law. Where only simple objects of direct perception are involved, and where strong social interests are not involved, this conception, which asserts the identity of opposites, will usually meet with no difficulties. Obstacles to this conception present themselves when social interests oppose it, or when it is no longer a question of ideas or concepts closely related to direct sense perception, but of general concepts far removed from sense perception. Here too I will give a few examples. It is very easy for us to realize today that the slave as well as the slave owner is a human being. Although socially there are the most extreme opposites conceivable. But if you had told a Greek, even the most intelligent, that the slave and the slave owner were alike as human beings, he would not have accepted it under any circumstances, and would have answered that they were absolutely opposed to each other, and that there couldn't be no identity between them. Or take a modern instance, the capitalist and the proletarian, the employer and the worker. Every bourgeois will take for granted that the capitalist and the proletarian are opposed. In fact, he will maintain that this opposition has always existed and will always exist, and that it cannot be bridged. In order to understand that this opposition is historical and transitory, one must have the point of view of the revolutionary working class. Or take another matter which is closer to you. We spoke before of a man and woman. Everyone will admit that man and woman, from the point of view of natural science, are members of the same species, that man and woman are homogeneous, human in the same way. But as soon as I come to the social realm, contradictions immediately arise. A whole series of major historical revolutions would be necessary for mankind to conceive and apply the idea that women should have the same human rights that man has. I don't have to tell you that in a great many countries of the Orient, practical recognition of the equality between man and woman has not yet been realized. In all these cases, a person who has not learned to think dialectically and who is moved by particular interests will maintain that these opposites are absolute. Only a person trained in dialectics will perceive the permeation of opposites. Of course, this does not depend only upon training in dialectics, but also upon the class viewpoint, the social viewpoint, which the individual adopts. I should like to consider one more question which belongs in the same field. You know that in the United States a social distinction is made between white and colored people, and in Europe between the European, who is supposed to represent a higher class, and the colored, black, and yellow races. To comprehend, both theoretically and practically, that these are not absolute opposites, but that they are united in the concept of mankind, which is shared equally by white, the black, and the yellow. To comprehend this requires not only a dialectically trained mind, but also a definite class viewpoint. The untrained mind, however, is confronted with peculiar difficulties when general concepts are in question. Difficulties which increase the more abstract, the more obscure, and the farther removed these concepts are from sense perception. That both day and night are parts of the 24-hour day is easily understood, but it is more difficult when with such opposites as true and false, and still more difficult with the concepts of being and non-being, which are the most general of all, the most inclusive, and at the same time the poorest in content. The average person will say, how can one unite such absolute opposites as being and non-being? Either a thing is or it is not. There can be no bridge or common ground between them. In the treatment of Heraclitus, I have already shown how the concepts of being and non-being actually permeate each other in everything that changes, how they are contained in changing things at the same time, and in the same way. For a thing which is developing is something, and at the same time it is not that something. For example, a child which is developing into a man is a child and at the same time not a child. So far as it is becoming a man, it ceases to be a child, but it is not yet a man, because it has not yet developed into a man. The concept of becoming contains the concept of being and non-being. In this concept, they permeate each other. Or let us take another example, which I have already given, the example of ordinary locomotion, i.e. when a body moves from one place to another. While it is moving, it is at a certain place, and at the same time, it is not at this place. I will take a third opposition, a great stumbling block for common sense, the opposition of material and mental, of materiality and thought, or of materiality and consciousness. The average untutored mind believes that these two opposites have nothing in common. The material is not mental, and mental is not material, and that is that. We have already demonstrated how both become a unity, how thought, the mental, is a material activity, is therefore bound to material. Now I will show you the obverse side of the medal, the other aspect of the proposition of the permeation of opposites. We said at the outset that there were no opposites which could be united, which could not be united, no opposites between which there was no identity. Now we maintain at the same time that there are no things between which there is not some difference, some opposition. In other words, the opposition of things is just as unlimited as their identity. To make this clearer, I will tell you a little anecdote taken from the history of philosophy. German philosopher Leibniz, who lived at the end of the 17th and during the first half of the 18th century, formulated the proposition that there are no two things which are not different. One day he was out walking with a group of courtiers. The conversation turned upon this proposition, and someone proposed to see whether or not there were two identical leaves on a certain tree, standing by the wayside. The ladies and gentlemen of the court examined the tree, and of course could not find two leaves which were perfectly identical. It is in the nature of things, as well as in the nature of mind, that no two things exist which do not differ. The same cannot be said of two raindrops. One will never be exactly like the other. Or take the smallest components of matter. Two electrons which form parts of an atomic system can never be absolutely identical. We can say this with certainty, even though we are not yet in a position to know anything about the individual peculiarities of electrons. As far as atoms and molecules are concerned, we can at least determine differences in kind. This is based on the proposition of the permeation of opposites, the proposition which says that the identity of things is just as unlimited as their difference. The capacity of the mind infinitely to equate things as well as to differentiate and oppose corresponds to the infinite identity and difference of things in nature. This is primary. You will also find the same thing if you compare all the most general concepts such as being and non-being, materiality, and thought, etc. We have previously shown that being and non-being exist simultaneously in becoming, that they constitute identical elements of becoming. But this does not preclude there being opposites at the same time, i.e., being and non-being are different. This law of the permeation of opposites will probably be new to you, something to which you have not previously given thought. Upon closer examination, you will discover that you cannot utter a single meaningful sentence which does not comprehend this proposition, except for the sentences such as, "A line is a line," where the subject and predicate are identical, a meaningless sentence. This proposition can be found everywhere. Let us take a rather common sentence. The lion is a beast of prey. A thing A, the lion, is equated with a thing B. At the same time, a distinction is made between A and B. So far as the lion is a beast of prey, it is equated with all beasts of that kind. At the same time, in the same sentence, it is distinguished from the kind. It is impossible to utter a sentence which will not contain the formula A equals B. For all meaningful sentences have a form which is conditioned by the permeation of opposites. The contradiction contained in every meaningful sentence, the equation and at the same time the differentiation between subject and predicate, had already been noticed by the so-called sophists of the classic period of Chinese philosophy, when they argued whether or not white horse was really a horse. Now our question is, what is the origin of this basic law? And this is the answer. In the first place, it is a generalization of experience in daily life, and in science we constantly have to search for the identities as well as the differences of things. And experience shows that there are no rigid, fixed limits to the discovery of either. Existing limits are mobile, relative, and temporary. They are constantly being broken, reset, and rebroken. Secondly, this law of the permeation of opposites may be deduced from the examination of thought itself. It is a law of thought as well as of nature. In thought, this law is inherent in the basis of consciousness, and this basis consists in the fact that I know that I am a part of the universe as a part of being, and, on the other hand, in the fact that I know myself to be distinct from the external world, distinct from other things. The basic structure of thought is, from the very beginning, a polar unity of opposites, and from this all other laws of thought are derived. Furthermore, this polar unity of thought corresponds to the nature of all things. Chapter 11. Dialectics 2. So far we have discussed the most general and most fundamental law of dialectics, namely the law of permeation of opposites, or the law of polar unity. We shall now take up the second main proposition of dialectics, the law of the negation, or the law of development through opposites. This is the most general law of process of thought. I will first state the law itself and support it with examples, and then I will show on what it is based and how it is related to the first law of the permeation of opposites. There is already a presentiment of this law in the oldest Chinese philosophy, in the of transformations, as well as in Lao Tse and his disciples, and likewise in the oldest Greek philosophy, especially in Heraclitus. Not until Hegel, however, was this law developed. This law applies to all motion and changes of things to real things, as well as to their images in our minds, i.e. concepts. It states first of all that things are concepts move, and concepts move, change, and develop. All things are processes. All fixity of individual things is only relative. limited, their motion, change, or development is absolute and limited. For the world as a whole, absolute motion and absolute rest coincide. The proof of this part of the proposition, namely that all things are in flux, we have already given in our discussion of Heraclitus. The law of the negation has a special sense beyond the mere proposition that all things are processes and change. It also states something about the most general form of these changes, motions or developments. It states in the first place that all motion, development, or change takes place through opposites or contradictions, or through the negation of a thing. Conceptually, the actual movement of things appears as a negation. In other words, negation is the most general way in which motion or change of things is represented in the mind. This is the first stage of this process. The negation of a thing from which the change proceeds, however, is in turn subject to the law of the transformation of things into their opposites. The negation is itself negated. Thus we speak of the negation of the negation. The negation of the negation logically results in something positive, in thought as well as in reality. Negation and affirmation are polar concepts. Negation of the affirmation results in negation. Negation of the negation equals affirmation. If I negate yes, I get no. The first negation. If I negate no, I get yes. The second negation. The result is something positive. Thus, even in ordinary speech, an affirmation results from a double negation. However, and this is the distinctive feature, the old and the original are not re-established by the double negation dialectics. It is not simply a return to the starting point, but something new arises. The thing or the condition with which the process started is re-established on a higher plane. Through the process of double negation, new qualities and a new form emerge, a form in which the original qualities are retained and enhanced. If the expression, law of the negation, sounds strange to you, you may also use the expression, law of the creation of the new out of the old, which is quite simple. This law has also been given a special formulation as a law of thought. As such, it assumes the following form. The starting point is the positive proposition or the thesis. All thinking starts with some kind of proposition, some kind of statement. This proposition is negated or transformed into its opposite. This new proposition, which negates the first, I call the opposite or antithesis. This is the second stage. Then this second proposition, the antithesis, is again negated. And, as you know, we then get the third proposition or synthesis, the negation of thesis and antithesis, into a higher positive proposition affected by the further negation. To understand this law correctly, one must guard against two misinterpretations or distortions. Thesis and antithesis are dialectically united in the final proposition, the synthesis. The dialectical union must not be mistaken for the mere summation of those qualities of two opposite things which remain after mutually exclusive qualities are cancelled. Dialectical development does not occur this way. This would simply be a mixture or effacement of opposites, a hindrance to dialectical method development. It is a necessary characteristic of dialectical development that it fulfill itself through negations. Without negation, there is no process, no development, no emergence of the new. In society, this negation is expressed in struggle which abolishes the old. False dialectics or pseudo-dialectics say that a mutual understanding, or a compromise, is attempted between the old and the new, that an attempt is made to unite the old and the new, without rejecting the old. I do not wish to imply, of course, that all compromise is a negation of struggle. A compromise may even be a weapon of struggle. This misunderstanding of the dialectics of development is due to the fact that the role of negation as an essential factor in unification is forgotten. But there is also an opposite misunderstanding arising from a disregard of the fact that the new which emerges from the process of development not only negates or neutralizes the old, but also retains the old. If this is ignored, the dialectics of development is distorted. As, for example, in the case of the French philosopher Henry Bergson. With Bergson, development becomes an incomprehensible, mystical process in which the relations between the old and the new are conceived of only as opposition and not at the same time as entities. The fundamental error in Bergson's conception of dialectics is his disregard of the fact that the new which has developed from the old stands not only in opposition to the old, is not only its negation, but has at the same time something in common with the old. If one follows the thought of Bergson, it becomes evident that it cancels itself. There is only one kind of negation in which the thing negated has nothing more to do with that form which the development preceded. This is complete or unconditioned negation or destruction. If I completely negate a thing, I destroy it, and development is completely stopped. If development is forced beyond its limits, as it is with Bergson, if it is made absolute, it is transformed into its opposite, into fixity or lack of development. Negation in the dialectical process is not absolute, unconditioned, or complete. It is relative, conditioned, and partial. Dialectics concerns itself with definite, concrete negation. The first distortion of dialectics, the distortion which disregards negation, may be called the opportunistic distortion. The second, in which the retention of the old and the new is disregarded, may be called the anarchistic distortion. These two opposed distortions of dialectics, the opportunistic as well as the anarchistic, are alike in that both put an end to development. The first because it puts an end to negation as the moving force of development, and the second because it puts an end to the connection between opposites. To make this general abstract law a little clearer, I will give a few examples. Take a grain of rice. Suppose I am giving you the problem of starting a developmental process with this grain of rice. How will you do it? You will put the grain of rice into the earth or into water according to whether you wish to plant wet or dry rice. What will happen? The first negation of the grain of rice occurs. The grain dissolves and out of it a rice plant develops. First negation. The grain of rice dissolves and changes into a plant. The original grain of rice is thereby destroyed. The second act proceeds of itself. The rice plant grows and finally develops rice grains, and as soon as it reaches the point where it produces seeds, grains of rice, it perishes. Second negation. The rice plant is destroyed, and the grain is reestablished, not the old but new grain, not one but many, and in all probability not of the old quality, but with the new characteristics. These slight variations connected with reproduction are, as a rule, inconsiderable and inconstant. However, their accumulation and consolidation result, according to the Darwinian theory, in the formation of new species from old. This process is an example of the negation of the negation. The double negation and reestablishes the original state, but on a higher plane, and in a different quantity. The Bergsonian distortion of dialectics, it is obvious, is very closely connected with the present historical position of the bourgeoisie. The mystical or falsified dialectics of the Bergsonian type rejects historical regularity and replaces it by miracle arbitrariness and incomprehensibility, whereby nothing is impossible. I will illustrate the two misunderstandings or distortions of dialectics of which I have spoken by using the same example. The first distortion, the Bergsonian, or as one could say, the anarchistic distortion, may be illustrated thus. The law of dialectics demands that I negate the grain of rice. This can be done more thoroughly, it might be said. Instead of planting it in the earth, I can put it into a mortar and break it to pieces. As a consequence, its negation will be so thorough that further development becomes impossible. This is the first distortion. It is apparent from this that for each thing there is a particular kind of negation which initiates a developmental process, a negation appropriate to the nature of the thing. The second, or opportunistic distortion of dialectics occurs when negation is ignored. The person to whom I give the grain of rice may say that it can develop, quote-unquote, of itself. He neither crushes it nor puts it into the ground. He will let it lie on the table, and of course it will not develop into a plant. It will finally perish as an organism. This illustrates, incidentally, how these two opposed distortions of dialectics have the same result. No development occurs and the object is destroyed. On the other hand, if I negate purposively and initiate a developmental process, the thing will be destroyed and at the same time it will develop into something new and higher. I will give you a second example drawn from the history of social or economic forms. You know that the very first mode of production of which we have any knowledge was primitive communism, i.e. the collective ownership of the decisive means of production by a small community of people. This primitive communism is the point of departure of all social development. It represents the thesis, the proposition. Primitive communism was dissolved, negated in the place of collective ownership of the means of production and collective production. There appeared private production, slave economy, feudalistic production, simple commodity production, and finally, capitalistic production. This is the antithesis. The negation of primitive communism is private production in its various historical forms. Then comes the third stage, the negation, in its turn, of private production, the re-establishment of collective property of communism on a higher plane. Through this twofold negation, the development returns to its starting point, but on a higher plane. Socialist or communist production, as it emerges from capitalist production, is no longer primitive communism, but communism at a much more developed stage, since it retains the technical achievements of capitalism. Man is now in control of nature, whereas in the stage of primitive communism, it controlled him. And the compass of modern communist society is vastly greater than primitive communism. At most, primitive communism could bring just a few communities together into an economic unit, whereas modern socialism or communism is capable of embracing the entire world economy. I have just emphasized the extent to which modern communism differs from primitive communism. Nevertheless, primitive communism is retained in modern communism. Common ownership of the means of production is reestablished. Capitalism is negated, dissolved into communism. But this negation is not absolute or abstract. It is relative, concrete, conditioned. Capitalist technology as well as cooperation in the factory are retained. Finally, I wish to illustrate the two distortions of dialectics in terms of this same example. The first distortion, which disregards the necessity of dissolving or negating capitalism in order to attain socialism, is the well-known reformist or opportunistic conception. The second distortion of dialectics in this field, the distortion which overlooks the fact that elements of capitalism are taken over for the construction of socialism, is the conception of anarchists. For these reasons, I have called the first the opportunistic and the second the anarchistic distortion of dialectics. History shows that these two distortions alternate and replace each other. We now ask, where does the law of the negation come from? What is its relation to the first main proposition of the permeation of opposites? Obviously, it is related directly to the law of permeation of opposites. It is the permeation of opposites as a process in time and sequence. The permeation of opposites as a process results in the law of the negation, or the law of development through opposites. The first main proposition, the law of the permeation of opposites, represents the most general relations of things from the point of view of structure or static being. The second proposition of the negation represents the relation of things as a process, i.e. dynamically. These two propositions are so related that they hold true for every process, for everything at the same time and to the same extent. The two propositions permeate each other. They form a coherent whole. The first gives a cross-section of the world, the second a longitudinal section. We now come to the third main proposition of dialectics, the proposition of the transformation of quality into quantity, and of quantity into quality. The proposition states that the mere augmentation of a thing or things produces a change of quality of characteristics, and conversely, that a qualitative change produces a quantitative one. I should like to illustrate this with a few examples. Let us take the first one from physics, water. Water has a definite temperature, and if you raise the temperature to a certain point, you will not get hotter and hotter water. But at a certain point, you will get steam. And likewise, if you lower the temperature, the water does not become colder indefinitely. At a certain point, it becomes ice. It freezes because of the decreased quantity of molecular motion. The temperature is merely an expression of the motion of the smallest particles, the molecules. If you change the quantity of the molecular motion or the speed with which the molecules move about, the characteristics will change at certain points from gas to liquid, liquid to solid. Conversely, ice can only be changed to water or water to steam if the quantity of molecular motion is changed. The finest example of the law of transformation of quantity into quality is now being given by atomic research. The various qualities of the atoms of chemical elements are correlated with the simple numerical relations of their components of the next lowest order, the electrons. An additional example from zoology and botany, you know that all plants and animals are composed, in the last analysis, of small elementary units of cells. Every living being develops from one or several small cells. All differences of living creatures derive from different quantities of cells. If I increase the cells, other organisms emerge with different characteristics and forms. Then there is the reverse process. It is possible to take a certain number of cells away from an organism without harming it. It will remain the same, but as soon as this is continued beyond a certain point, the organism is harmed. If a man's hair is cut off, he does not suffer, but if his arm or leg is cut off, he will undergo a qualitative change. In fact, he will probably die. You may draw a certain amount of blood from a person, but beyond a certain point, death will result a qualitative change. A last example from political economy. You have learned in political economy that a sum of money can only function as capital after it has reached a certain minimum amount. $1, for example, is not capital, and neither are $10. $10,000, however, may function under certain conditions as capital. A mere change in quantity changes a sum of money into capital. It takes on different characteristics, produces a different effect. A qualitative change occurs. If capital is allowed to grow through concentration and centralization, a new qualitative change takes place, namely a change to monopoly capital. You know from your political economy that monopoly capital has characterized an entire period of capitalist development, i.e., the imperialist period. And on the other hand, as soon as you have monopolistic capitalism, this new quality is in turn transformed into quantitative relations and characteristics. Monopoly capital realizes a higher rate of profit than non-monopoly capital. Monopoly prices are generally higher than prices under free competition, etc. We ask, finally, that what relation obtains between this third proposition of dialectics and the first two. And the answer is clearly that the law of the transformation of quantity into quality and vice versa merely represents a special application of the first proposition, the law of the permeation of opposites. Quality and quantity are polar opposites. Quality is quantity analyzed. Quantity is quality analyzed. An apple, a pear, and a plum all have different qualities. They can only be counted together if their different qualities are abstracted from them or negated. I cannot add an apple, a pear, and a plum. I can only say 3 pieces of fruit. In other words, negated quality is quantity. Negated quantity is quality. These opposites are contained in each thing. Each thing has a definite size, quantity, or degree, and at the same time definite characteristics. All things have at the same time quality and quantity. As opposites, they permeate each other and are transformed into each other. This brings me to the end of dialectics. Of course, it must not be assumed that knowledge of these few propositions makes one completely familiar with dialectics. A long list of other propositions, which we cannot discuss here, derive from these few main propositions. Nor must it be assumed that the mere memorization of formulas is the key to dialectics. The important thing is to be conscious of the dialectical nature of things and of thought. Dialectical thinking is not magic, neither is it part of everyone's natural equipment. It is an art which must be learned and practiced. The most general characteristic of dialectical thought is the study of things, and their interrelations, in both one beside the other relations and one after the other relations, that is, in their changes. Chapter 12. Theory of History and Dialectical Materialism 1. We now turn from dialectics to the theory of history and dialectical materialism. Like dialectics, the theory of historical materialism is not a means of mere contemplation, but it is an instrument for action. Revolutionary theory is an indispensable means of revolutionary practice, of revolutionary politics. For the revolutionary politician, historical or dialectical materialism is what the compass, watch, and sextant are for the captain, or the laws of physics for the technician. Dialectics is the universal instrument. Theory of history is a special instrument, the instrument, namely, which makes possible scientific orientation to social relations, which makes possible the establishment of their laws of motion. Only through knowledge of laws of motion is scientific prediction of the future possible, and only on the basis that is appropriate revolutionary action possible. The materialistic theory of history is epoch-making precisely because it is the first to permit us to foresee the main features of historical development and purposively influence it, and, within certain limits, to master it. Thus, it is not only and not chiefly the explanation of past history, but also and above all the theoretical basis of the way man makes history. Understanding of the laws of nature is the basis for free command over it. Understanding of the material laws of history opens the road to human freedom. Divorced from revolutionary practice, the materialistic theory of history would be lifeless. It has been said, he who understands only chemistry does not understand even it. He who seeks to understand materialistically only the past does not understand it. In one of the previous chapters, we have already formulated the basis of historical materialism by saying that the manner and mode in which men earn their living determines all other aspects of social life. This manner and mode determines, above all, social viewpoints, thoughts, or ideas, i.e., social consciousness. In other words, material social life determines the ideal social life, or, to use a Marxist expression, social being determines social consciousness. Since the material determines the ideal, even in social matters, this doctrine is called historical materialism. From what has already been said about dialectics, it should now be evident that this doctrine is a special application of materialistic dialectics to the social relations of man. At first glance, this doctrine appears very reasonable, but one must not overlook the fact that it runs directly counter to so-called common sense. Common sense postulates the matter thus: all human action clearly proceeds from the mind, from aims which man sets. In accordance with the aims man sets for himself, the plans he has, he will act thus and thus, so that one can say that common or everyday sense is in no way disposed to the materialistic theory of history. But if one looks more closely, one discovers that this conception only touches the surface, for immediately the further question is raised: how the aims, the ideas in the human mind, according to which man acts, emerge. Whence comes this or that content of social thought? Or, to take a concrete example, how does it happen that the Chinese peasant in the period of Kangzi in the 6th century BC thought very differently from the peasant in the year 1927? Or how does it happen that the Chinese entrepreneur has a wholly different attitude towards strikes and trade unions from the Chinese worker? As soon as we ask such questions, we at once emerge from the realm of mere ideas and are forced to look for the reasons why men 1,000 years ago had other ideas than they have today, and why today the peasant class has ideas different from the entrepreneur or worker. Merely to explain these different ideas through other ideas is not to explain, but to abandon explanation. In order to understand how in the course of history certain social ideas have been destroyed, how one set has been superseded by another, or how in one and the same society different classes can have diametrically opposite ideas concerning what is right, what is good, etc. To understand this, we must go back to the material basis of the ideas. We must go from social consciousness back to social being. Historical materialism does not deny the fact and the influence of thought and consciousness. On no account does historical materialism maintain that men have no thoughts in their minds, or that they do not act according to certain ideas. But it explains the ideas and aims by the material structure of society. Contrary to all idealistic thrones of history, it does not consider thought basic and primary, but derived, dependent, secondary, something which is an effect of certain material relationships. We now want to determine more exactly the nature of this foundation, this manner and mode in which men earn their living, or, as Marx called it, the mode of production. What is the mode of production? By mode of production, dialectical materialism understands the reciprocal relations into which men enter with each other when they produce or work, or, to put it very tersely, the reciprocal relations of men through their work. In the last analysis, it is a question of how men are grouped in regard to the means of production. In other words, to whom do the means of production belong, and how are they utilized? We will best understand the meaning of mode of production if we take some one form of production and determine its foundation and essence. Let's take the capitalistic mode of production. Its characteristic is that the means of production, the machines, factories, raw material, etc., are separated from the person who produces, the worker. We have a class of men who are the owners of the means of production, but who do not operate them. We have, on the other side, a class of men, the workers, who own no means of production at all, but only their labor power, men who can only work when they are employed by the owners of the means of production. The capitalists, the second, characteristic is that these are legally free men. And the third characteristic is that the means of production, machines, tools, raw materials, are socially operated. That is, there are always a number of workers working together at a machine in a factory. Let's contrast this with simple commodity production, as we have it in a small handicraft or in a small or medium-sized agricultural economy. Here the relation of men to each other is different from that under capitalistic conditions. The person who does the work is also owner of the means of production. The farmer owns the land, the farm buildings, the agricultural instruments, and the cattle. The handicraftsman owns his shop, his tools, and his raw materials. The second criterion of this simple commodity production is that there is no collective work by many in a single enterprise, as is the case with capitalism, but the individual producer works with his own tools. These means of production are the private property of the producer and are managed by him privately. In agricultural or handicraft enterprise, we have cooperation of the producer with the tool belonging to him. But, and this is characteristic, we have no direct planful cooperation of these individual producers in a collective economy. Society is broken up into a vast number of producers, each one of whom works independently of the others. In capitalistic production, conscious cooperation of many men extends to the factory or to a number of factories which are bound together in an economic unit. In simple commodity production, planning embraces at most an artisan and a few journeymen, or a farmer and his family. A third characteristic example is primitive communism in its different forms. Here the society collectively owns the important means of production. Individual ownership of the means of production is here only a minor importance. Labor is directly social. This is true neither in simple commodity production nor in capitalistic economy. These are a few examples of the relation of men to the means of production which characterize the different production systems or modes of production. They are, of course, only examples and not complete presentations. The production system or the relation of men directly in production is also determined by the apportionment of the products. For this, the terms distribution and circulation are used. This kind of determination is very clear under capitalist relations. The class to whom the means of production belong is accordingly also the proprietor of the labor products, the commodities. The working class, not being the owner of the means of production, has therefore no claim to the products of its labor. It receives only a part of production. It gets its living only in the form of wages directly from the hands of the class which owns the means of production. On the other hand, we see that in primitive communist relations, where there was no private ownership of the means of production, the collective product just as inevitably belongs to society and is partly consumed in common, and partly divided among individuals according to set rules. Thus, the mode of production, the relation of men to the means of production, also determines the mode of distribution in the given society. The mode of production or form of production must not be confused with the concept of branches of industry. Capitalist mode of production, feudal mode of production, primitive communism, slave economy are all forms of production or modes of production, because at their base lies a thoroughly distinct mode of social behavior and production. But one cannot speak of hunting, fishing, or agriculture as modes of production. Hunting, fishing, agriculture are not different forms of production, but only different branches of industry or sources of livelihood, since every one of these branches of industry can be socially conducted in highly varying manner. You have agriculture under primitive communist relationships. You have agriculture carried on by slave owners. You have agriculture of the feudal variety throughout the Middle Ages. You have agriculture under the relations of simple commodity economy. And finally, you have agriculture under capitalistic relationships. The oldest fishing enterprise was certainly communistic, carried on cooperatively by a group of fishermen. Then you have fishing as simple commodity production, where the individual fisherman goes out with his own net. Today, fishing is a modern capitalist industry, in which a capitalist is the owner of a fishing boat with the necessary nets, etc., and hires wage laborers. The mode of production or the system of production must also be distinguished from another concept, which is confused with it, the concept of technology. The mode of production is a relationship of men to each other, a social relationship. Technology pertains to the relation of men to nature. Therefore, such expressions as machine production, etc., betoken not mode of production or production system, but a certain technology of production. This is the case when we speak of Stone Age, Copper Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age. These are different periods of historical and prehistoric times in which stone, copper, bronze, and iron tools were employed. This is not a classification according to the mode of production, but according to kinds of technology. We have seen that the mode of production is decisive and basic for the establishment and development of all other social relationships. It is, so to speak, the motor which drives the entire social development. But one can pose the further question: what determines the development of the mode of production? What determines society's transition from primitive communism to simple commodity production or to feudalism, from feudalism to capitalism, from capitalism to socialism? The general law which governs the changes of the mode of production is the development of the productivity of labor. Productivity of labor may also be designated as the fruitfulness or yield of labor. If one surveys the whole range of forms of production which humanity has passed through, one finds that the progress from one mode of production to another is governed by the increase of the productive forces. This is the general law. The foundation and presupposition of this law is that each mode of production reaches a definite peak of productive forces, a definite peak of technology. The dynamic impetus from one mode of production to another, the impetus which pushes development forward, is the opposition developed within a given mode of production, the contradiction between the mode of production and the productive forces. I will further explain what we mean by productive forces. They are those forces which contribute towards the manufacture of a certain number of products. Every previous mode of production permitted the development of productive forces, or the yield of labor, only up to a certain point. As soon as this point was reached, this mode of production, formerly an improvement, became a hindrance. This obstacle is cleared away by a transition to a new and higher mode of production, a transition which, as soon and as long as society is divided into classes, into ruling and ruled, takes place through a social revolution. An example taken from the development of agriculture makes this clear. The first primitive agriculture was carried on communistically. It was a community enterprise. This primitive communistic agriculture went through a series of stages of technical and economic development. It developed agricultural economy up to the point where it became a hindrance. There followed the transition to another form of production, let us say to peasant economy, to simple commodity production. Communal ownership of arable land was replaced by individual ownership of the land and the means of agricultural production. This individual ownership of land made possible a much more intensive cultivation, which increased the forces of production. China is probably the country in which the increase in the productivity of peasant economy has reached its highest point. In its turn, this peasant economy also reaches its limits and appears backward as soon as higher methods are developed, as soon as agriculture can be mechanized. Under peasant relationships, one cannot employ steam power, electricity, or any of the discoveries of modern technology. This already presupposes the transition to capitalistic enterprise. The latter, in turn, develops its own particular bounds or limits, which are conditioned by peculiarities of the capitalistic mode of production. The particular economic limits which the capitalistic system of production imposes upon the development of agriculture you probably know from discussions of ground rent and political economy. The next step towards a broader development beyond the stage will be the transition to a socialist agriculture. The persistent force that governs the transition from one mode of production to another in agriculture is the advance in the productivity of labor. The advance from one mode of production to another does not occur of itself. It is not automatic. It is made by men, and as a rule it is made by that part of society or that class in society to which the existing mode of production has become a hindrance to development, and whose productive role already supplies the pattern for a higher mode of production. We may now consider classes. One speaks of oppressed or exploited, of feudal and of capitalistic classes. Classes have not always existed, and one can foresee that they will not exist forever. A division of society into classes appeared only after a relatively long development in consequence of the division of labor, which was introduced into the primitive class of society. The class structure was historically introduced through the disintegration of primitive communism, and it is intimately bound up with the establishment of private property. Class membership is determined by one's relation to the means of production. If we examine contemporary capitalistic society, what chief classes do we distinguish, and on what basis do we distinguish them? 1. The owners of the means of production, who do not themselves work and who set these means of production in motion through outside labor power, the capitalist class. 2. Those who do not own the means of production, who place their labor power at the disposal of the capitalists, the workers. These are the fundamental classes of contemporary capitalist society. Their differences is determined by their relation to the means of production. 3. We also distinguish a class which is still pre-capitalist, but which exists under capitalistic conditions. The class which owns its means of production and itself works, the small farmers, the handicraftsmen, or simple commodity producers. Well, let's take Greek or Roman antiquity. Here you can distinguish on one hand slave owners of the means of production and of slaves, and on the other the slaves, those who do not own the means of production. There were not even free sellers of their labor power. They were simply a commodity. Moreover, in antiquity, there were also handicraftsmen and free farmers, simple commodity producers. Here too, as under capitalist relations, class membership was determined by one's relation to the means of production. Chapter 13. Theory of History and Dialectical Materialism 2. As I have already explained, the formation of classes grows out of the social division of labor. But it is not true that every social division of labor coincides with the formation of classes. Division of labor is manifest in an Australian horde, for example, but there are no classes. There is certainly division of labor in a peasant family which employs no outside labor power, but this division is certainly not based on class differences. Classes do not emerge until the division of labor reaches the point where a surplus product beyond what is necessary is regularly produced, and a social group or social groups regularly appropriate, in whole or in part, the surplus product of another group. Economic exploitation of one part of society by another is the foundation of the class structure. In isolated, irregular cases, there also occurs exploitation of one communistically producing society by another. This is actually one of the most important starting points for exploitation and class structure within the same society. For class structure, it is essential that the exploitation occur within the same society and that it no longer be sporadic and irregular, but regular, periodic, and self-generating. The basis of castes and ranks is likewise the class structure, though here other determining factors are involved, such as heredity, marriage only within the group, etc. The class structure is a general foundation which does not prevent the structure of castes and ranks from deviating in individual cases more or less widely from this foundation. At the same time, it consolidates and guarantees exploitation. It is in the nature of every class structure to be grouped about these two poles, about those who produce surplus product or surplus value, and about those who, without working themselves, appropriate the surplus product. In short, class opposition revolves about the opposition between groups of exploiters and groups of exploited. Accordingly, when I say classes, I necessarily mean class opposition, that is, the presence of economic groups with opposing interests. A given class society need in no way be limited to two classes, to an exploiting and an exploited. There can also be more classes, and as a rule there are. But because of its oppositive relation, the role of exploiter and exploited is decisive. It must be carefully noted that class opposition signifies no more than that in a given class society there are classes with opposing economic interests, and this means, in the last analysis, that there are classes with opposing functions or roles in production, in exchange, and in social life in general. Class opposition is thus something objective, actual, something independent of the consciousness or the recognition of men. It is as objective as the opposition between positive and negative electricity. This latter opposition does not depend on whether the electric particles know they are positive or negative. Neither does it depend on whether men observe this opposition or not. The opposing interests of classes or class opposition necessarily produces the struggle of classes or class struggle. Class struggle thus means no more than class opposition breaking out into action. Class opposition as process or as occurrence is class struggle. Class struggle is thus the mode of existence, the mode of life of class society. Class society without class struggle is as inconceivable as matter without motion, or as a piece of matter without molecular heat vibrations. The class struggle, therefore, is not an invention of Karl Marx. In the first place, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were not the first to discover that there is a class struggle in history and that there are classes. This discovery was made before them. What Marx and Engels established was not the presence of classes and the presence of class struggles, but their fundamental significance for the course of history and in class society. They perceived in the class struggle the key to all history, since the emergence of classes. This is what is new in the theory. In the second place, it is naturally ridiculous to assume that there was no class struggle before Marx and Engels, that these two first provoked the class struggle. There have been class struggles as long as there have been class societies. They already existed several thousands of years before the birth of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. It was the contribution of Marx and Engels that they first of all brought to the working class as well as to other exploited classes a clear consciousness of their interests and of the opposition of their interests to those of the exploiting classes, and that they thereby introduced planning, consciousness, and organization into the class struggle of the workers. When one speaks of the relation of communists and socialists to the class struggle, one always implies certain forms and a certain content of the class struggle, the higher conscious organized forms of the class struggle in contrast to the elementary and unorganized forms. The class struggle embraces a whole host of different forms. These forms of the class struggle are as various as the forms of motion of a piece of matter. Let us take a piece of ice. At a low temperature, the molecular motion is slow. At a high temperature, it is fast. At a certain temperature and pressure, the physical condition of ice changes. It becomes fluid or gaseous. Its forms of motion can be varied. We speak of mechanical motion, heat motion, chemical motion, etc. Within mechanical motion, we further distinguish different degrees, faster, slower, rest, etc. Just as you have different forms and degrees here, so you have different forms of the class struggle. I will cite a few examples of the different forms of class struggle of the working class. The most primitive form in which the working class rebelled against its oppression by newly established capitalism was the destruction of machines, the Luddite movement. The destruction of machinery was accomplished by sabotage. Houses of the manufacturers were set on fire, etc. This was only an early form of motion. There to follow forms of struggle, such as the individual strike, strike in one factory, strike in one branch of industry, strike in all industries in a locality, and as the most highly developed form of strike, the political or economic general strike. Further, we have the class struggle in the political realm, verbal and written agitation, and propaganda, election struggles, demonstrations, and finally, the struggle proceeds to different forms of armed struggle: partisan struggle, armed insurrection, and revolutionary war. Every one of these forms of struggle in turn has its peculiar divisions, phases, and subforms. That sometimes peace treaties are concluded and pauses occur in the class struggle does not alter the fact that class struggle is a perennial phenomenon in class society. A war does not cease being a war, even though battles are not always raging. Sometimes there are marches, there are pauses in the fight, armistices are declared, but this does not alter the fact that a war is a unitary, connected action. The same is true of the class struggle. It not only has various forms and subforms in various degrees, it too is interrupted by armistices, peace treaties, etc. These interruptions do not, as a rule, apply to the class struggle in general, but only to particular forms of the class struggle. Even the reformists, who in principle are for class collaboration between bourgeoisie and proletariat, are unable to abolish the class struggle in its entirety. They try to limit it, to check it, to disperse it. Above all, they try to prevent its sharpening into the armed struggle of the working class for power. But they too cannot abolish it. Thus, the recognition or non-recognition of the class struggle has very little practical significance. The forms of struggle, the forms in which a class struggle is enacted, are not arbitrary. They are determined by the peculiar nature of the class which struggles, as well as by the nature of the classes against which the struggle is waged, and also by those allied with these. That is, by the total interrelation and degree of maturity of all classes. For example, the strike is a natural form of struggle for the working class because it corresponds to its role in production. On the other hand, the strike was impossible as a weapon for the bourgeoisie when it struggled for power against the feudal classes. The bourgeoisie, when it struggled for power against feudalism, employed wholly different means in the preparatory stage of the struggle. Chiefly the means of refusing to assent to taxes. The bourgeoisie used its money power to extort, to buy, or to acquire underhandedly certain rights from the feudal classes or the absolute monarchy. In 1905 in Russia and today in China, we see sections of the bourgeoisie seizing upon the weapon of the strike. This is a sign that the working class already occupies the leading role in the struggle, and that the proletarian forms of struggle are carried over to sections of the bourgeoisie. Thus, the forms of struggle of the different classes of the bourgeoisie, the proletariat, the feudal classes, and the agricultural classes are not arbitrary, but they depend on the economic and social role of each individual class and on its relation to all other classes. Just as various and manifold as the forms of the class struggle are the contents or the objects of the class struggle, these contents can be economic, political, or cultural. They can consist of a struggle for higher wages or a struggle for the bettering of working conditions. They can be a struggle for the election of a parliamentary representative or of a president of the state. The struggle for the development of schools as a cultural content, the struggle for the control of the army, a politico-military content, the exposition of a philosophy, a cultural content. Thus, very different contents or objects can lie at the basis of the class struggle, can be the aim, the purpose of the class struggle. I want to stress that these contents, just like the forms of the struggle, are determined by the nature of the class. The bourgeoisie, in its struggle against feudalism, will choose contents different from those of the working class in its struggle against the bourgeoisie, or the peasantry in its struggle against feudalism. Class opposition produces the class struggle. The class struggle at a certain level produces class consciousness or class ideology. The class consciousness and class ideology react upon the class struggle. Now we pose the question, what is class consciousness? Class consciousness is the consciousness first of the community of interests and of the position of the members of a class, and second, and this is linked with the first, the consciousness of the opposition of the interests of this class to the interests of another class. This consciousness that all workers have common interests, or all small farmers have common interests. This consciousness of the oppressed and exploited classes is not present from the outset. It emerges only through the class struggle of the oppressed and exploited classes. It is at first carried on planlessly, instinctively, without a common consciousness. Class opposition, which has broken out into struggles, produces, first of all, the consciousness of the opposition of the oppressed to the oppressing classes, and then this produces the consciousness of the community of interests of the oppressed class or classes. This is no wonder, since the exploited or oppressed classes are ruled not only by authority but also by intellectual power. They are ruled by the ideas of the ruling classes. Class consciousness is first developed in struggle. In the course of the struggle, it becomes clearer and sharper at the same time, extending itself to an ever greater section of the class. At first, as a rule, only a small minority understands that the members of a class have common interests. Gradually, this class consciousness becomes more and more clearly defined. There arises a need for special organs which will embody the most enlightened consciousness of a class. From these interests, there spring up what we know as political parties. Political parties constitute that part of class which, through an especially clear consciousness, defines its position and tasks and is able to lead the struggle of the class planfully, consciously, and in an organized fashion. Class consciousness can reflect the interests of a class more or less correctly or falsely. Therefore, to avoid confusion, we must distinguish between class consciousness and its narrower and wider senses. Class consciousness, in its wider sense, embraces the false as well as the correct consciousness of the interests and position of the class. For this, the expression class ideology is used, that is, collective ideas which a class builds up about its interests, regardless of whether its ideas are true or false. In the narrower sense, class consciousness means correct class consciousness, the correct conception of the interests and position of a class. In this sense, it is used in connection with the working class. When we speak of more or less class-conscious workers, we mean that they see, more or less clearly, the unity and the identity of interests of the working class and their opposition, in principle, to the interests of the bourgeoisie. False class consciousness is also called class illusions, that is, fancies which a class has of its position and its interest. Such fancies, are such as class illusions, occur just as often as a single individual has illusions concerning himself. As a dialectical materialist, one must distinguish between what a class really is and what it believes itself to be. These are two different things which must be kept rigidly separate. One of the best known and most frequent of these illusions is the assumption of exploiting and exploited classes, that as long as they struggle in common against a third class, they have no interests opposed to each other. Furthermore, I should like to point out that there are not only self-deceptions, there are also, of course, conscious deceptions, ideas which one class sets in circulation to deceive and misguide other classes. Self-deception proceeds very easily into conscious deception of others. All ruling classes have used and use certain means to set false ideologies in motion. to deceive oppressed classes in regard to their interests. As a rule, they do not thereby deceive themselves. Fundamentally, the entire press, literature, and the schools of the ruling class are a means of spreading false ideologies, of confusing the class consciousness of the oppressed classes. As the highest degree of class consciousness, we can designate the scientific comprehension of the nature of class and its laws of motion, on the basis of dialectical materialism. Class position or class membership determines in general the class consciousness or the class ideology as well as class delusions. This law is valid for the great mass of every class, for the class average. To make this clearer, I shall give you an example from physics. You know that in the theory of gases, one makes certain declarations of law about the collective motion of a gaseous mass and about the average motion of a particle of gas, but one is not able to give an account of the motion of every single particle of gas. Such laws one calls laws of average or statistical laws. Something similar is found in the theory of the average behavior of the smallest part of the atom. Although the motion of every one of the smallest parts of the atom cannot be followed. Laws in the realm of the social have a similar character. The determination of class consciousness through class position is valid for the average of the membership of a class, for the class as a collectivity. This does not mean that individual class members do not shift from one class to another, or do not assume the consciousness of another class, either above or below. As an example of such phenomena, we may take the case of Marx and Engels, the founders of the dialectical materialistic worldview. Marx and Engels both came from the bourgeois class and became advocates of the working class. They changed their class consciousness. They elaborated scientific socialism and for decades led the struggle of the working class. They crossed from one class to another. On the other hand, you have a number of individual cases of workers who go over to the bourgeoisie and develop not proletarian but bourgeois class consciousness and become propagandists of this class consciousness. These individual cases do not undermine the general law. Rather, they are a part of this general law, just as accidents or individual deviations are a part of regularity in general. Such phenomena as the passage of individuals from one class to another are frequent at crisis in revolution. At such crisis, for example, at the transformation of a bourgeois revolution into a proletarian revolution. This applies to Marx and Engels. It also applies to the history of the Russian Revolution, and last but not least, to the history of the revolutionary movements after the war. Classes are not the only groupings of men in a given class society. Besides class groupings, there are numerous other groupings. I refer to groups which are formed around occupations, groupings of men according to religion, according to level of culture, according to race, according to national citizenship, etc. Of these groupings, the last named, those according to race and national citizenship, are especially important, and these groupings have also been made the point of departure for certain theories of history. There is a theory of history which claims that race is the decisive factor. Historical materialism does not deny that alongside of class groupings there have existed and still exist numerous other groupings, but it maintains that class groupings is decisive for the course of the history of class society, whereas national, religious, and other groupings play a secondary role. In conclusion, I will consider two other concepts which play an important role in the theory of history: the concepts of revolution and evolution. The relation of these two concepts is correctly understood only if understood dialectically. That is, if it is understood that these two concepts, revolution and evolution, are opposites and at the same time constitute a unity. By revolution, one means fundamental change in the relations of power between classes, so that the previous ruling class is overthrown and replaced by a class formerly oppressed. Every transition from one mode of production to another is accomplished in class society by political and social revolution. The external characteristic of a revolution is suddenness and violence, but one cannot say conversely that every violent or sudden act represents a revolutionary event. Revolution depends upon a fundamental change in the power relations of the classes. It achieves the violent solution of existing fundamental social contradictions, of existing fundamental class oppositions. It is the dialectical or progressive impulse of history under class relationships. Now let us take the second concept, evolution or development. Evolution designates social development within a given power relation of classes. The relation of the two concepts in class society is as follows. Revolution extracts the essence of accomplished evolution. Evolution, or development, prepares the way for revolution. On the other hand, every completed revolution, every transformation of a given fundamental power relation of classes, brings about a new evolution. Revolution is the form of the passage from one form of society to another under the conditions of class society. Mark well the last qualification, under the conditions of class society. The passage from one social form to another is accomplished through revolution. This does not apply when there is no class society. We have had a number of forms of society before the emergence of class society, which dissolved each other without social revolution. And moreover, after contemporary class society is abolished, we shall have a social development which will not be accomplished in revolutionary forms.